well, it seems like it's always an interesting year to be a dairy farmer. It's been an interesting year to be a dairy economist because of all the issues that have been happening with dairy policy, with the markets. So let's, the thought here from Dave and Nicole in particular was to have a little presentation, a little conversation about some of the issues that have been going on. And let's see if I can maybe shed a little bit of light on it. And we'll see where it goes from there, okay? So my outline for what I plan on talking about here today is I'm going to spend a lot of time on how farm milk prices arrived at. And in doing that, we're going to get at some of the issues that relate to depooling and negative PPDs, probably in reverse order. I should have put that in reverse order. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about checkoff because I think Dave said that was something that people wanted to discuss a bit. And then I will have a few comments on market, on the kind of where we're at and what the market has been doing kind of recently and what kind of factors I think are important in the next few months and into 2021. And then I wanted to mention a couple things that you guys might, ladies and gentlemen, might want to consider signing up for that are out there right now. So for me, it's useful to think of the farm milk price being composed of the federal milk marketing order price, and this would be in almost all of the United States. Until recently, California had its own state order, which operated a little bit differently. And the last about 2 years, they've had a federal order. I think if you have a conversation with some of them, they would tell you it's been a bit of a mixed bag on what they think about the federal order compared to the state. But almost all of the milk in the United States gets marketed. About 75% of it goes through the federal milk marketing orders. About another 15% goes through a state order in some way, shape, or form. Western New York has a state order that kind of operates in conjunction. In Pennsylvania's got a program there, and Maine and Nevada has one. So there's lots of different state ones. But basically, I'm going to kind of lump that together and call that the milk marketing order price. And I'll talk mostly about how it works in the Northeast order this evening. So the federal milk marketing order defined the minimum prices by class use and then pool them and pay a uniform price. The second part is the regional market aspects, which is the cooperative and or the state and regional issues. So that has to do with what your co-op situation is if you're marketing milk through a co-op, or your processor situation if you're maybe direct shipping to an investor-owned firm instead of a co-op. What product mix they have, what contracts they have, where the milk is going. It's been particularly important in the last 7 months since this pandemic, where your milk has been going, in the sense that the big effect that this pandemic had was that it basically shut down food service, and everybody had to be buying, go to grocery stores and retail outlets, and largely away from food service. Although, to be fair, takeout has certainly ramped up, and takeout pizza is way up and things like that. But for the dairy industry, what that's meant is if you were situated so that you weren't maybe real reliant on food service contracts, then maybe it didn't affect you much. In fact, maybe your business boomed because you got to sell more things in the grocery store. But that really depends on the situation. And in general, actually, in the last, let's say, 5 years, the Northeast has had some kind of balancing and premium issues related to, in some months, maybe having a little bit more milk than they could find a home close by for. And so that's resulted in excess balancing cost in terms of either high hauling costs to move the milk to some place where you could sell it, and then maybe selling it at a lower price because it's a distressed milk sale. And Northeast is not the only part of the country that's been having that issue. The Mideast, which is mostly Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, has been having that issue in a big way also, and it's resulted in some excess balancing costs and balancing costs that get borne by the farmer, and you end up with a lower milk price, everything else equal. And then the last part that I'm really not going to spend time on this evening is the farm specifics. So that your specific protein, butter fat, somatic cell, your specific hauling costs and any other situations that might apply to you, stop charges, volume premiums, anything of that nature that maybe are farm specific. So nobody, right, has the same farm milk price. But if we're all talking about the same milk marketing order, then we've got the same minimum prices and the same blend or uniform price. So, and we could actually further break down part one there by saying it's the class 3 price plus the uniform or blend differential difference, which is called the producer price differential. And the reason that might be useful to think about is if you were hedging or forward contracting milk, then you're probably looking at class 3 because that's the market with most of the volume. So you would be thinking about the class 3 as the part that you could protect or lock in, and everything else that's on this page would be contributing to basis risk most of the time. And then the question, if you're thinking about risk management, is how much of my total mailbox milk price am I protecting versus, and what could I do to minimize that basis risk? But that's actually not what we're talking about today, so I'll move on. So federal milk marketing orders, why do we have them? They've been around since 1937. Actually, originally they were authorized by the 1933 Farm Bill, but that was struck down and they were reauthorized in 37. And the whole idea was to provide an adequate supply of grade A milk. Grade A milk is milk that's, well, it's virtually all the milk that gets produced in the country at this point in time. Back then it was not, and it's milk that's suitable for beverage consumption, fluid consumption. And the idea was to bring about orderly marketing, because if you think about, especially in the Great Depression and coming out of that whole issue there, well, first of all, we didn't have the technology and transportation and packaging that we have today, but also we had some discrepancies in market power between buyers of milk and farmers that were selling a perishable product. And so the idea was, or what had been happening as far as disorderly marketing was, there were periods when you would go to the store and there wouldn't be milk there, and at the same time maybe producers were having to dump milk because they weren't getting paid an adequate price. And so the whole idea was to make certain that there would be an adequate supply of milk, obviously important for nutrition and hunger in this country, but also that the farmers would have some bargaining power and be assured of some minimum price so that they wouldn't have to worry about whether they were going to find a home for the milk tomorrow or they were going to get lowballed and end up deciding it was not even worth taking it to market. And I think from looking at that perspective, the federal milk marketing orders have been wildly successful in the sense that almost never and almost nowhere do we worry about whether there's going to be milk on the shelf. Although, maybe in the early days of the pandemic, that got challenged a bit. And we certainly have lots of milk production. And in fact, you need to keep the beverage milk consumption in mind, because the federal milk marketing orders, when they were designed, were really about beverage milk consumption. And that was the foundation. And that will be a lot of what gets discussed if we have federal milk marketing order hearings, because the question from the USDA's perspective will be, what does this do as far as the beverage and fluid side? Federal milk marketing orders do not restrict supply. They don't regulate producers. They don't guarantee a fixed level of price. They don't set maximum prices, and they don't set wholesale or retail prices. What they do is set the rules within which the milk markets operate as far as establishing a minimum level of classified pricing at the farm level. They enforce payments for milk in the supply chain. They verify and audit records, and they provide market information. So that, and the last one I think is an undervalued aspect of federal milk marketing orders, in the sense that because we have this monthly information and we know how much milk has been marketed and what uses it went to, and everybody's kind of on the same level playing field from that perspective, that they wouldn't necessarily be at all if we didn't have federal milk marketing orders. So this is a map of the federal milk marketing orders today. In 2000, there was federal order reform and consolidation, and we went from 31 orders down to 11. And at that point in time, actually, California was a state order, so they were not on the map, but there was another order that was Nevada, Utah, and the southern part of Idaho. That was called the Mountain Order, or Mountain West Order. I forget whether it was Mountain or Mountain West, sorry. And that one got voted out, 10, 15 years ago now. The producers in that order voted it out, and it has been no order there since then, but California came in 2 years ago and is now a federal milk marketing order, so we're at 11. Now you'll notice that there's a lot of white spaces on here, areas that are not covered. So you look at Western New York and it's not covered, and that's in fact covered by a state order. But also, it's about where the milk is marketed, not where it's produced. So if you're in the white part of New York and your milk moves east into the shaded part and to a plant there, then you're going to be pooled on the Northeast order. Similarly, if you look at like Missouri, the whole center part of Missouri is like white. It's not part of the order, but there's essentially no plants there, so it doesn't really matter because the milk is going some direction that's covered by one of the orders. Okay. So federal milk marketing orders define minimum prices based on end use. So there's 4 classes of end use, and these are kind of big classes in the sense that there's lots of little products that are captured in each one of these. So there's class 1 for things that you drink, class 2 for things that you eat with a spoon, which is yogurt, ice cream, cottage cheese, sour cream, class 3 for cheese and dry whey, which are joint products, class 4 for butter and non-fat dry milk. California, when they operated a state milk marketing order, had 5 classes of milk, but now they've moved to these 4, and we all have the same 4 classes in all 11 milk marketing orders. Although I guess maybe it's worth mentioning that the marketing orders, 4 of the marketing orders here do not use component pricing. They still use a butterfat pricing, and they're the ones in the southeast part of the United States. And those are largely driven by beverage, so that we're talking about Florida, the Southeast Appalachian orders. But the other ones are component ones, and I'm going to talk about the component ones because that's what the Northeast is, and that's where most of the milk is in component orders.
So Chris, there is a question.
Sure.
Jeff Miller asks, do they consider cost of production when establishing marketing areas and prices like the Northeast?
Okay, that's a good question, Jeff. The answer is not directly. So I'll get into it a little bit more. These minimum orders, or minimum prices, excuse me, come from the wholesale prices of the products. And as far as defining these marketing areas, the idea was more about what beverage markets they're serving. So the thought was that the Northeast order is going to be serving the bigger metropolitan areas in the north, the Northeast and the North Atlantic, or Mid-Atlantic, excuse me, areas, right? So one thing that the Northeast order has going for it is it captures Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Baltimore. So as opposed to, you look at the upper Midwest, and that's basically Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, and no other big cities, which is why the Northeast has a high amount of class 1, which is fluid milk, and the upper Midwest is 85% cheese. So hopefully but let me get a little bit more into where these minimum prices come from, and you'll see that, so they're not considering cost of production at the farm level, okay, at all. So if that's what you're asking, then the answer is no. It's all about servicing the beverage markets, and then we now have so much milk that's qualified under these orders as grade A and met the standards that it's, we now have, for example, the biggest use of milk in this country is in class 3, which is for cheese and dry whey. And that's, has its pluses and minuses. One of the pluses is that, cheese has been the one that's driving the milk consumption increases in a large way for the last few decades, and continues. In fact, we just set a record, 38.6 pounds of cheese per person consumed in 2019, which is the most that we've ever consumed in this country as far as cheese goes. It's still below places like France and Italy, so maybe we can still increase it, but it's certainly been increasing that way. So hopefully that answered it. If it didn't, follow up later, but let me talk a little bit about where these class prices come from, okay? So we define, basically federal milk marketing orders do two things. They define minimum prices based on how the milk is used, and then they calculate a weighted average of how the milk is used in each one of those geographic orders, and say that everybody in that order has to get at least the minimum or uniform price. And then the producer price differential is actually an accounting procedure that says we're going to calculate the weighted average price, which is the uniform price, then we're going to subtract out the class 3 price. And the idea there was driven by that whole cheese is driving things. So let's get the cheese paid first, and then the residual that's left over is called the producer price differential, which is the pool value in excess of the class price. Let me take one more little side note here, which is to say I'm going to talk about all of this basically in terms of dollars per hundredweight. So, you know, I'm going to give you class 1 through 4 prices in dollars per hundredweight and talk about it that way. But actually, it's a multiple component order, and what they do, and technically, all of this is done at the component level, which is to say there's a butter fat price and there's a protein price, and this is all actually done at the component level, and then we add it back up to get a hundredweight price. So, and I just, you know, whenever you do milk pricing and dairy policy in this country, there's always a question of how far into the weeds do you want to go. I have a good friend of mine that I went to graduate school with, who is a high-level economist in Washington, D.C. for a big organization. He's a very smart guy, and I like to frustrate him all the time whenever he thinks he's got dairy policy by bringing up one more wrinkle, because there's always something else. So I'm just mentioning the component aspect to say that I'm going to do this all at the hundredweight level, but really, if we wanted to break it all down, we could go into how many pounds of butter fat went into class 1, 2, 3, and 4. What was the butter fat value in those? How many pounds of protein went into 1, 2, 3, or 4? Class 1 has fluid carrier, and then we've got to put it all back together. So that's my way of saying I'm going to wave my hands at that, but I'm going to do this all. Okay, so at the hundredweight level. So here's how we get class prices. Every week, the National Ag Statistics Service, which is part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, collects wholesale cheese, butter, non-fat dry milk, and whey product prices, basically dry whey prices, nationally. And they collect this every week, and they do a monthly average based on the weighted average across the weeks that they get for the month. From those wholesale product prices, we calculate component prices based on yield factors. So we say, okay, cheese, it takes 10.1 pounds of milk to make cheese, and cheese has this many pounds of protein, this many pounds of fat, and butter, has this much protein, this much fat. So we get component values, which is to say, how much is $1 of butter fat worth, and how much is $1 of protein worth? And you might have noticed in your milk check, right, that, well, for a long time there, prior to like say 2014, 15, protein was largely driving your milk check, and 2/3 of the value of your milk check was probably protein or somewhere in that neighborhood. And then we had a period there in the last 5 years where butterfat was very valuable, and butterfat values, in fact, it flipped, and I think it was 2016, 17, somewhere in there. Butterfat was actually 2/3 of your milk check. So, these component values, butterfat and protein, matter. And they determine things like at the farm level, like how you're going to feed probably, because you can feed for more of one or the other, how you're going to breed, what breeds you're going to have, things like that. Butterfat gets affected by things like heat waves. really hurt the fat. So all of these things, and you can see that in the responses of how much butterfat gets produced month to month, and then that affects the supply and demand and the prices there. Okay, so from those component values, we can then put it together at a hundredweight level and get the class prices for 1, 2, 3, and 4. And by the way, class 3 and class 4 are the same across all of those orders in any month. Okay, so class 3, which is cheese and dry whey, and class 4, which is butter and non-fat dry milk, those two prices are the same for the whole United States at the minimum level. Okay, and you can get paid more than the minimum. You just can't get paid less than the minimum unless you're a cooperative, because co-ops are paying themselves. So the minimum prices are not technically legally binding to the co-op. Over the long haul, one would hope that they would at least be legally binding, because you could, leave and market your milk somewhere else. And quite frankly, in most places, in a lot of periods, they pay above minimum prices. Unfortunately, the last few years, we've been in this situation where we've been at minimum prices a lot. And then from getting the class prices, then we get the farm price. So I already mentioned this. I'll just put it up here again. So class 1 is bottled milk, cultured buttermilk. It's eggnog. We're going to the holiday season, so hopefully, people will be drinking eggnog. Class 2, yogurt, ice cream, packaged cream, which, by the way, has been a real increasing category of dairy consumption in the last 5 years. People have gotten the message that fat is not bad for you, and also that it tastes good, which is true. And so there's been a lot more packaged cream and different uses of cream, which is great. Class 3 is cheese. Class 4 is butter, non-fat dry milk. I'm just going to throw these prices up here, and I'm not going to spend time on this, okay? So I just want to show you, for example, the class 3 price for the whole United States is this class 3 skim price times 96.5, 0.965, because we're assuming, we're standardizing, by the way, all the class prices to 3.5% butterfat. Now, of course, that's not how you get paid. You get paid on your actual component value. So, but when we report these prices, we report them at a standardized value. So plus 3.5 times the butterfat price. And the class 3 skim price is based on the protein price and the other solids price, and the protein price is based on cheese price, okay? And the class 4 price is based on the class 4 skim milk price plus the butterfat price. The butterfat, by the way, is valued the same in class 3 and class 4 at the minimum level. And then the class 1 price is based on the class 1 skim price plus the butterfat price, plus it's going to be some, and there's a differential in there based on where you're marketing the milk. So it's going to be higher, for example, in Florida than it's going to be in Wisconsin. And so there's lots going on behind these, and I don't want to spend time on them, but I'd be happy to send them to you or discuss them further if you want. But in general, here's what I wanted to get to. So class 3 and class 4 prices are calculated directly from product prices, okay, using the previous month's weekly averages. So the milk that's used for cheese and the milk that's used for butter, okay, are based on the butterfat and protein values that come from cheese, butter, dry whey, non-fat dry milk prices from the previous month. The class 1 and class 2 prices, which are, by the way, specific to the order, okay? So the class 1 prices in particular has that distance differential, which is, by the way, basically derived from work that was done at Cornell by Mark Stevenson and Andy Novakovich, which is based historically on how far you are from Eau Claire, Wisconsin, which is kind of up in the center, northern center part of Wisconsin, but kind of less so now. But basically, the idea was that was the excess, a location of a lot of excess milk that could move if it needed to. So, you know, you're going to have a higher class 1 differential in the Northeast than you are in Wisconsin, but you're going to have an even higher one in Florida because they need the milk to move to the Southeast because, you know, that's a big deficit area. The Southeast part of the country is by far the biggest deficit part of the country as far as milk is concerned. So class 1 and 2 are derived, it should say from if I could type. The factors, the same factors that were in class 3 and 4, plus some differentials or premiums. But also part of the class 1 and 2 prices are based on an advanced price that's calculated using the first 2 weeks of product prices of the prior month rather than all 4 weeks. Okay, so there's a timing issue there. So class 1 and 2 use an advanced price. Let's see if I can. So see this on this slide right here. Class 2 skim is advanced class 4 skim plus 70 cents. That advanced price is from the first 2 weeks of the previous month instead of all 4 weeks of the previous month. Okay, but the butterfat price is actually based on all 4 weeks of the previous month, just to make things even more confusing. Okay, and this timing issue right here has been the driver of the negative producer price differentials that we kind of used to see. Not what we've seen in the last 4, 5, 6 months, but what we used to see. So because those prices were from the first 2 weeks versus all 4, if we saw a big change in that last 2 weeks, we could conceivably have a really big positive PPD, or we could even have a negative one. If we had a negative one, that meant that the prices for class 3 and 4 increased a lot in the last 2 weeks of the month and weren't captured in the first 2 weeks. But that meant that they would be captured in the next month. So historically, I would have said, hey, a negative PPD, that's no fun, and you don't like to see a negative number on your check. But what that means is your next check is going to be bigger because it's going to come in to the next check. That also meant, by the way, if there was a big decline in the last 2 weeks of the month, that you wouldn't see that whole decline on that check, that some of it might come in that check and the rest of it would come in the next one. So you kind of had this lag effect, which smoothed out milk pricing a little bit.
So I have another question.
Sure.
So Jeff was asking, are wholesale prices always directly proportional to retail prices when looking at it?
Absolutely not. No. So as Jeff has correctly surmised, wholesale prices, right, is not, specifically not retail. It's not what you're going to pay if you go into Kroger or Safeway or wherever you choose to shop. Those are the retail prices, and wholesale prices are, you know, what the retailers are buying the product at. And in fact, we know from research and historically watching these that in fact price increases at the wholesale level are going to be, in general, not always, but in general, more quickly reflected in the retail prices than our price declines. And that's not always true, but it's often true. And in fact, you know, there are times when we can see fairly big price declines at the wholesale level and the retail doesn't cut back. If you talk to the retailers, they will tell you, in general, when I've talked to them, what I've heard is, hey, you know, we like to be consistent unless we're having a sale. So we don't, if we drop the price to reflect a cheaper wholesale price, we might have to bring it up, you know, next month, and consumers don't like to see a price increase. Of course, you may have noticed that in the meantime, they're going to make more money off that. So it is definitely true that there's an asymmetric price response between the wholesale and retail levels. And that's not just in dairy, but it is in particular in dairy. But farmers get paid based on wholesale prices. That is definitely true. So hopefully that answers your question, Jeff. So typically, because the class 1 price, which I'm calling P1 here too, and so this means price 1 class, price 2 class. That's what I'm calling P1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay. And we use Roman numerals. I don't know why, we just do. So typically we would expect, because the class 1 price is actually built off of the class 3 and class 4 price, and the class 2 price is built off of the class 4 price plus differentials, we would typically expect the price of class 1 to be the biggest and the price of class 3 and 4 to be smaller, and maybe, you know, P1 greater than P2, greater than P3, greater than P4. But whoops, sorry about that. Recently, as in the last few months, we have definitely seen that anything is possible. And in fact, in the last few years, the price of class 4 has been greater than the price of class 2 in the last few years, about 40% of the time, which seems crazy, since the price of class 2 is the price of class 4, plus that 70 cents a hundredweight differential. And the reason has to do with basing it on the price of class 4 skim milk is based on the first 2 weeks. Well, the price of class 4 butterfat is based on all 4 weeks. And so if we have a big change, and by the way, butter has been a star in the last few years as far as your milk price, but it's also been, you know, fairly volatile sometimes, right? So we had a long period of time there where butter never went below $2 a pound. And in fact, in the fall, you know, there were several in the last 5 or 6 years that we would hit $2.50 to $3 a pound in the fall when buyers were building their stocks for the holidays. Because, by the way, right, we're rolling into the time of the year when butter consumption is at its highest with the baking around the holidays, which is a good thing because butter is great. But some of this volatility has meant that we've seen the price of class 4 being greater than 2 a large portion of the time, which makes your basis even more volatile. Okay. So we define these minimum prices using those formula that were above, that were, again, remember, 3 and 4 are the same across the country. 1 and 2 vary by order, but in particular 1, that's the one that matters the most. So but then we figure out how the milk is used in each one of these classes in each one of those orders. So where did it go to? How much of it went into the bottle for class 1? How much of it was yogurt and ice cream? How much of it was cheese? How much of it was butter? Okay, we figure out, and so this is percentage used in each one of those classes. And the top part of the table is for the whole United States in 2015 to 2019. And one thing to keep in mind here, you don't see it a whole lot, I guess, is we didn't have California in those orders in 2015 to 17. So, but for the whole United States, about 28% of the milk goes into the bottle in 2019. And you can see that that's down a bit from 2015, and then the long-term trend would have been, you know, down for many decades now. Class 2 is the smallest class by use, 11.5%. Class 3 is the biggest one, 43% in 2018. And class 4, which is butter and non-fat dry milk, was 15 to 20%. Now the Northeast order, which pretty much I would think everybody that's on this evening is marketing their milk into, has a little bit higher class 1 use, also trending down a bit over this time period. It has higher class 2 use, right? There's more yogurt here. There's more, there might be more cottage cheese. I think there's more sour cream in the Northeast order than there is in the other orders. So that's class 2. Class 3 is a little bit lower. Okay, so less milk goes into cheese here. Still a substantial amount of milk into cheese, 27% in 2019. But lower than the US average. And class 4, I guess, well, it had been above the US average, and it was a little bit below in 2019, but about the average. So actually, the Northeast order is fairly well balanced as far as not too dependent on any one class. Kind of has a, if we were thinking about diversifying, has a fairly diversified portfolio. You know, if you think about, now, maybe you'd prefer to have all of your milk in class 1, although not in the last 4 months, but most of the time, and you know, that's Florida, right? So if you look at the Florida order, it's something in the neighborhood of 80 to 85% of the milk in class 1. And they have that high differential of, you know, it's $4 or so, a hundredweight, a high differential. So they have a high milk price, but on the other hand, there's a lot of people in Florida, and it's not the best place to milk cows. Cows don't particularly like the heat and humidity, and it's not a great place to grow forage either. So, you know, there's things that offset that. So on this, just it graphically shows what we had on the previous line, which is to say the Northeast is a little more class 1, a lot more class 2, and less class 3 and 4. Okay. So for farmers, then, the federal milk marketing order price has 2 parts, which is to say the class 3 price, which is the kind of base price, which again, the whole idea here when this was put in place was cheese is the growing part of the milk consumption, is growing the most anyway, and it's the biggest. So what we'll do is we'll pay the cheese first, and then what's left over is the PPD. The producer price differential, which is the pool value in excess of the class 3 price. Okay. And the statistically uniform or blend price is always at 3.5% butterfat, 2.99% protein, 5.69% other solids. So this isn't, you know, if you've got, you know, jerseys and you've got 4.5%, 5% butterfat, obviously you're going to get paid for those components. And these prices are not what you'd be receiving, but these are the base prices, and then the components are built off of that. So the uniform or blend price is the weighted average, which is these percentages times the class price. And we do this on a monthly basis. These are annual averages, those numbers there, but we would do this every month, right? So we get a uniform or blend price, and I'm sorry, I tend to go back and forth. That's why I write them both there. So when I say the blend price, I mean the weighted average. So, you know, 32%, if that was the class 1 utilization, 0.32 times the class 1 price plus 0.24 times the class 2 price plus whatever, and it adds up to 100%, and that's your average price. And that's the blend price that everybody needs to be paid, at least that much. In the order that month. Okay, and then the producer, which is the producer price differential plus the class 3 price. Another way of writing it. So this is like, you know, that if you do farm management, you know, assets minus liabilities or debts equals equity, right? It's an accounting definition. Well, this producer price differential is an accounting definition, which is to say it's the blend or uniform price minus the class 3 price. And we would expect that most of the time, well, actually, I don't think we spent a whole lot of time when we were doing the federal order reform thinking about negative producer price differentials. Okay, so what it says is take out the cheese value and the remainder is the pool value. So, for example, for August 2020, this is from the Northeast order, 28.6% class 1, and there's your pounds of milk, 646 million pounds of milk. Well, not last month, I guess it was 2 months ago. The most recent one that's up there, though. Class 2 was 595 million pounds of milk, up for 26.3. Class 3, 628 million. So what the market administrator is doing is tracking where all of this milk goes, okay, and figuring out the utilization, and then putting values on it based on those formulas that came from those wholesale product prices, accounting for yield, and then putting it back together, okay? So the total milk pooled in the Northeast order in August of 2020 was 2.26 billion pounds of milk. And those were the weights. And so this is also August of 2020. There's your protein price, your butterfat price. You can see protein, just for comparison, by the way, there's 2019, August of 2019. And you can see that, I mean, look how much higher that protein price is. That's driven by those cheese prices that we've seen recently, right? So, I mean, look at that. That's $2 a pound higher on protein. But unfortunately, $1 a pound lower on butterfat. So there's your class prices for August, $23.03 for class 1. And that, by the way, depends on where you're at, because there's some slight differentials if you're in Boston versus you're in New York versus you're in Baltimore. Sorry, I don't have all the Northeast. I've been at Cornell for about a little over a year, and I'm glad to be here, but I spent 22 years before this in Michigan, so I can remember more about the differentials in the Mideast order than I do the Northeast at this time, but I'll try to get better.
Need his freeze?
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. Did we just lose?
Okay, so if you take 8.6, 3.27, and so on and so forth, you get a weighted average or uniform price of $18.02. Okay, and so if the uniform price is $18.02 and the producer price differential is the uniform or blend price minus the class 3 price, and the class 3 price is $19.77, then $18.02 minus $19.77 is minus $1.75. And there's your negative PPD. So you can see where the producer price differential was in August of 2019. It was a positive $1.37. And you know, this math, well, first of all, nobody likes to see a negative number on their paycheck. Okay, so I don't blame anybody for that. If this meant, by the way, that we were going to see much higher prices in the next month, then, you know, maybe we wouldn't be so unhappy about that. But there are some reasons beyond that price dynamics that cause this negative producer price differential. And let me see if I can explain that a little bit.
So one question from Monica was basically, she would like to know, is it correct to advocate for higher wholesale pricing in the first 2 weeks of the month with retailers in order for farmers to receive a higher farm milk price? Or does it all cancel out at the next month anyway? So basically going back to that advance.
Right. Right. So there's definitely discussion. Well, I won't go all the way back there. That's a good question, Monica. There is definitely discussion at the current time about whether the advanced pricing is needed. The idea was that some of the processors, the fluid ones in particular, needed to know with a little more lead time because they don't have a storable product. Okay. You know, if I'm making cheese, even if I'm making Italian cheese, I can store it. If I'm making, you know, cheddar cheese, I can maybe store it and it gets better, although I don't know if it makes any sense to store it at current prices. That's a whole nother issue. But the idea was that that advanced price gives them an idea earlier on so that they can figure out their contracts and get that set. I think there's a debate at the current point in time about whether they still need that advanced pricing and whether we could just do away with that and just price it over the whole 4 weeks like we do with everything else, and that everything would be fine. And I think that's one change that you will definitely see debated. I don't know. There's a lot of discussion about whether we need federal order reform. I think a lot of the players involved think that there's at least worth a discussion on some of these issues, and that would be one of them that might come up. So it's a good question and a good point, and I think you'll see it followed up on here to the extent that we have some ordered hearings and discussions. So, but it's not just that advanced issue that's driving it. Historically, that's been the primary driver. The other issues that have been coming up now are depooling of class 3 milk, the spread between the class 3 and the class 4 price, and then reblending of market returns by co-ops, okay? Which is to say the co-ops, again, don't have to pay minimums. I mean, they want to. They're going to want to return the highest price that they can. But, you know, if they have to dump milk or they have to, because of balancing issues, haul milk a long ways away and sell it at distressed prices, they're going to reblend those potential costs into everybody's milk check, and that's going to result in some lower prices. And that's been happening in some locations in some periods. Okay, so let's talk about each one of those issues. And you know what? Let's see. So this just, sorry, this is a little redundant. So historically, the negative PPD was caused by a large increase in class 3 or 4 price, which especially towards the end of the month, which led to a negative PPD because of the lag, okay? In 2020, it's caused by large price increases, which did happen, right? We went from class 3 price going, what, down to 1370 in April, or was that May? And then bouncing up $6 or $7 in the next month. So that's a large price increase, and that's going to cause a negative PPD. But we also had a movement a couple years ago from pricing class 1 off of the average of class 3 and class 4. When it used to be, sorry, we moved to pricing it the average of class 3 plus class 4 plus a 74-cent differential, when it used to be the higher of class 3 or class 4, and then the depooling. Okay, so here's an example that we saw in June. In June, the class 1 advanced price was announced on May 20th based on the prices in the first 2 weeks of May, which was $1.18 a pound cheese, which was low. Okay, so we were still in the kind of first big wave of the pandemic when everybody was at home, things were shut down, restaurants and food service places were not selling much, and the cheese price was very low. In fact, by the way, on the spot market, I think it went to like 94, 95 cents at one point. But the average over the first 2 weeks of May was $1.18. The June 2020 class 3 prices based on the cheese price for the whole month, well, they bounced back in the latter half of May because remember, we got real tight on fresh cheese. Okay, and so, and the average cheese price was more than double that. It was more like a $2.40 something. Okay, so we had class 1 price based off of cheese at $1.18. The class 3 price was like $2.40. And so that was a negative PPD. So this is, there's a lot going on here, so I'll simplify it in just a second. But this is for the Northeast order. And this is every month. So the price of class 1 by month, January through August, the percentage of class 1 use, so percent of Q1, and I've got in this one. You can see, 30 to 35%, 28 to 30%, 35%, I guess, in June. Then the same deal with classes 2, 3, 4, then the uniform price and the PPD. So a couple things that I want to point out here. First of all, take a look at the class 3 price, which is P3, which is kind of in the middle of the table. So we were at $17 to start the year, $16.25 in March, collapsed $3.18 drop from March to April to $13.07, drops further into May to $12.14 when we really kind of hit the bottom of it. When then the June price bounces up $9, $8.90, and then another $3.50 for July. So we've got that big increase here in prices, which leads to, and then but class 1 price comes up much slower, right? So class 1 price is at 22, 20, 19, drops to 16, drops further to 14.67 from May to June at the same time when the class 3 price increased $8.90, catches up part of the way in July, and then finally class 1 is above class 3 price in August. Okay, unfortunately, at the same time, class 4 is languishing down here and hasn't really recovered, right? I mean, look at class 4. We went from $16 to 11 to 10.67, which is a really low price, and bounced back a bit into that $13 range, but still nowhere near what class 3 did. And I should have called more attention to it earlier, but the class 1 price is based off, at least in part, on the average of the class 3 price plus the class 4 price averaged plus 74 cents. Now, we used to, until 2 years ago, the class 1 price was the higher of class 3 or class 4. And that's part of the reason why we used to know when prices climbed in either 3 or 4 that the higher prices was coming to class 1. And part of the reason it doesn't now is because of this big discrepancy between class 3 price and, I mean, so what, in June we're at $8.14 different. In July, 7 something different. In August, you know, $7.24 different. So that's a big difference. If we had the higher of rule still in place, and before you ask, yes, that will probably be discussed if we do order reform. And I will tell you that the argument for going to the average of class 3 and class 4 plus 74 cents instead of the higher of was that it would make it easier for fluid processors to hedge their milk price if they knew. Because if you're a fluid processor and you wanted to hedge your input cost, what you were paying for your milk, if you were using class 3 prices, let's say you were hedging 6 months in the future. So you were looking at, I don't know, March of 2021. And you wanted to use class 3 prices to hedge it because, well, maybe just because there's more liquidity in that market, because there is in fact more liquidity in that market. And in fact, we got to March of 2021 and actually the class 4 price was higher. So that was driving your input costs because you still got to pay minimum prices. Then in fact, that's contributing to basis risk for the buyers on the fluid milk processors. And so the argument was, well, they're not going to use or not going to be as amenable to using these contracts because they don't know which whether it's going to be class 3 or class 4 price that's driving their costs. And that actually was valid. That's true. They didn't know what was going to be driving it. So if I instead tell you, hey, it's going to be 50% of the class 3 price plus 50% of the class 4 price plus 74 cents, well then if I want to hedge my milk, I can hedge class 3 and 4 and I can have less basis risk. Definitely that's true. I don't know that anybody at the time thought, hey, maybe class 3 and 4 prices are going to get $8 different. And if it does, then that's going to contribute to, so that $8 difference means that class 4 is dragging down class 1, and that's contributing to the higher PPDs. Okay, so we've got 2 things so far going on. One is timing, because those 3 price increases are entering with a lag. The second one is because we're pricing it off of the average of 3 and 4 plus a fixed differential of 74 cents. The difference, the class 4 price is dragging it down. And you can see we had a negative 538 PPD in June, a negative 546 in July, and a negative $1.75 in August. So, not good news, right? You want that to be positive, everything else equal. And I can see why you'd be upset about it. Here's what's going on with utilization by month, which was in this table here, but I think it's easier to see in the graph, which is to say the percentage of class 1 is the blue line on top. And you can see that in June, actually, the percentage of class 1 increased. Well, why did that happen? Well, one of the reasons that happened is that we're doing this in percentage terms. And you can see that the month that the class 1 percentage increased greatly, the percentage of class 3 dropped greatly. Well, reasonably, right? It went from 25% to below 20. So it dropped by a good 20 to 25%. The class 3 did, and that is depooling. And I'm going to talk about that momentarily. So 1 and 2 were up a bit in percentage terms. 3 was down, 4 was down. And then here's your prices. You can see at the beginning of the year, they were fairly well behaved in the sense that 1 was the highest, and then 2, well, the uniform is green, so 1 is blue, uniform is green, which is the average one. Then 2, 3, and 4 basically went net order until we got to, May, at which point you can see the class 3 price takes off, and the uniform and the class 1 price kind of follow it, but with a lag. And so if we were looking at this graphically here, the difference between the gray line and the green line is the negative PPD. Okay, as soon as the gray line goes above the green line, the uniform is above class 3. Class 3 is above the uniform, excuse me, and we get a negative PPD. So that's what happened there. And it didn't just happen in the Northeast. And in fact, there were bigger numbers. And I'm going to show you a couple of tables that John Newton at American Farm Bureau put together. John does a nice job putting this together. And I want to make certain that I give him credit because he makes pretty figures. So I'm just going to use his for a couple of them here. But here's your producer price differentials for June and July of this year. You can see the Northeast is the second one from the right. And in fact, 538, 546, that's not good, but it wasn't nearly as bad as some of the other ones. Bigger than the upper Midwest, but much smaller than California. Look at the California July one, minus 982. And Southwest, Central, Mideast, all in that $8 to $9 range. Driven by the same things that we've been talking about, but there was more depooling in California and the Southwest order than there was in the Northeast. And so I want to talk about that momentarily. Well, so depooling, okay. So basically all pooled milk, all milk that gets pooled on a given month in the given order must pay the farmers at least the uniform blend price, except for the co-op exception. But honestly, in a practical sense, especially over the long haul, the co-ops have got to pay in that neighborhood too. Otherwise, why would anybody be a member of them? And of course, co-ops are farmer owned, so they're farmer members, and they're trying to return the prices best price that they can. And by the way, here's the other thing. You've got to pay at least that uniform or blend price, but you can pay more, okay? If you collect some premiums because you have a contract with somebody that says, hey, you know what, we'll pay you class 3 plus 25 cents, or we'll pay you class 1 plus some premium. And those do occur, unfortunately, because of, they maybe are less common than they used to be, those premiums, maybe because we've had a lot of excess milk in some places. But keep in mind here that these federal milk marketing orders are defining minimums, not maximums, and so you can certainly get paid more than that. Okay? Basically, higher price milk users pay into the pool while lower price milk users get a draw from the pool, which is to say, if I'm buying milk for beverage, so if I'm a bottler, okay, and P1, the price for class 1 milk is higher than the price for class 3 milk, then the fluid buyers pay into the pool. And the cheese milk buyers get a draw. So everybody gets a uniform, but the way we get to the uniform is that the fluid milk buyers pay a little more money because P1 is higher, and the cheese milk buyers collect a little bit of that extra so that we can all have the same weighted average price. And again, both of them are allowed to pay above that. They can't pay below that. But if the price of class 3 is higher than the price of class 1, so we have what I would call an inversion there, like what we've had for the last 3 months, then the cheese milk buyers would be paying in, and the fluid milk buyers would be receiving a draw. So the money would be flowing in the opposite direction. But go back and remember that the reason the federal milk marketing orders exist is to make certain that there's adequate supply of beverage milk. So depending on the order, if you're a cheese milk buyer, you don't necessarily have to pool your milk all the time. You can depool it, which is to say, hey, my milk is not associated with the order this month, okay? So fluid milk must be pooled. They don't have a choice. Cheese milk does not need to be. Although to be part of the order, so anytime P1 is greater than P3, the cheese guys want to be in the order, probably. But if the price of class 3 is greater than the price of class 1, depending on how much difference it is, they may not want to be part of the order. But in order to make certain that they can be part of the order in the months when P1 is greater than the price of class 3 milk, they have to meet the order qualification rules, which is to say there's these things called touch base, which is to say you need to have a certain percentage of your milk that is pooled in certain months of the year, usually high demand months like September and October, like right now, when the kids are in school. Well, I wish they were in school. When the kids are normally in school, you have to have a certain percentage of your milk, and it depends on what months and how much milk has to be included, depend on the order that you're in. And some orders are more stringent and some orders are less stringent. Furthermore, if you depool, the orders will have some qualification period to requalify. So it might be the case that if you depool, if you pull this milk out, you can't just say, hey, next month I want back in. Instead, you might have to pool it for a couple of months before you requalify it, and then you can get a pool draw again. So there's definitely a calculation here. You don't just go, hey, I'm out, I want out. Because it has financial implications depending on where you pooled it. The Northeast order has relatively strict pooling standards. The Southeast order has strict pooling standards. California does not have very strict pooling standards, and neither does the Upper Midwest, which is Wisconsin and Minnesota. So class 3 milk, because the price of class 3 has been above the price of class 1, especially in June and July, had an incentive to depool. Okay, if we're talking about producer price differentials of 8, 9, 10 bucks, then you've got a pretty big incentive to say, nope, my milk's not part of the pool this month, if I can get away with it. Now, if I depool, okay, if I do pool, if I'm a cheese plant and I depool, what do I have to pay my farmers? I'm not in the order anymore for that milk, so I'm not bound by minimum prices. And so the short answer is you got to pay whatever it takes to get the milk that you want to buy, right? Because then we're talking about no regulation on that, although you might have some contracts with depends on the way it's set up. But basically, you got to pay whatever price it takes to get in the door. Well, if I'm a cheese plant and I depool, if I pay the class 3 minimum to my producers, then they're going to get a higher price than they would have been for that milk if it was in the pool. Because remember, the PPD is negative. So they'd certainly be happy with that, right? So one option is I depool and I pay my farmers the class 3 price that I was going to have to pay if I pooled anyway. And that results in them having a higher price, and they're going to be happy about it. But, geez, I don't have to pay the class 3 minimum price. Probably. So what if I pay them the blend price that they would have gotten anyway? So I didn't pool that milk, so I don't have to send that class 3 minimum price to the pool, which would then get distributed back to the class 1 farmers through the pool through the blend price. Instead, if I just pay the minimum or pay the uniform price, then the producers I was buying milk from are going to get the same price they would have anyway, and I save money. Or those are the two extreme ones. I could go somewhere in between. I could pay the uniform plus a little bit, and I could split the difference, say. Let's say that, that it was $2 difference, that class 3 was $2 higher than class 1 price. Maybe I could just pay $1 higher. Then my farmers are happy, and I'm happy because I made $1 extra. But because I depooled and I didn't send this milk to but remember, there's more than my farmers in the pool, right? In the order. So all the other producers that are in the market, that weren't part of that plant or organization that depooled are worse off because the uniform price is lower, because class 3 price was the highest value class use, and I didn't pool that money. I didn't pool that milk, so I don't have to pool the money. So are you happy about depooling? Well, maybe if you are shipping to somebody that depooled and they share the profits with you, then sure. If you're not with somebody that depooled, and then you're definitely worse off because your blend price is lower, like unequivocally lower. Okay, so that's that's what happens. Your blend price is lower, which means the PPD is lower, because remember the PPD is the blend price minus class 3, and you have an even bigger difference now between the class 3 price and the blend and the uniform price. So what happened, this is John's chart again. And by the way, these are pounds. So it says $sign on the vertical axis. Ignore that. It's why it says $sign all over the place. Never mind. Ignore that. These are pounds. So what happened to how much milk got depooled? Well, this is, take June and July of 2019 and compare it to June and July of 2020, which were the 2 months when we had big incentives to depool. Well, how much milk got depooled? It was 8.1 billion pounds across the United States, across these orders that got depooled in those 2 months. So 32% less milk. So, but where did it really happen? It happened in the Northeast. Well, it happened in the Northeast in June, actually, but it's not so clear that it happened in July, because according to this, if you compare it to the July of 2019, there was more milk pooled, which doesn't mean that milk couldn't have been depooled, because it really was how much did you normally would have pooled, and we could have had a production increase that offsets that. So, but really, Upper Midwest, 2 billion pounds each month. Depooled. Central California, quite a bit of depooling. Although to be fair to California, actually, they were already depooling a lot the previous year. So it's not showing up as much here. And then much less in the Northeast, Pacific Northwest, different pooling. And so one of the things, if you don't like this depooling, okay, one of the things you could do is increase the qualifications. In other words, change the months and the amounts where you have to pool to qualify, and or have a longer or more difficult qualification to re-qualify the milk. Now this California one is kind of interesting because under the old California order, you couldn't depool the milk. There was no depooling under the state order. So this has been a pretty big change for California to go to a situation where there's lots of milk being depooled, which, is interesting to me. I suppose it's neither here nor there to you. I'm not sure in California. So what did this do to the utilization? So we depooled this amount of milk. So this, again, compares the 2019 utilization for June and July, which are the light and darker colored blues, to the utilization for class 3. Again, the cheese plants are the ones that have the incentive to depool, right? Because they were the high price. The butter plants didn't have an incentive to depool. The yogurt plants didn't have an incentive to depool. Then the fluid plants can't depool, so it doesn't matter. But so look at this. The Northeast, again, second from the right. Pretty big drop there in June from 29% class 3 utilization in June of 2019 to 19%, so 10% decline there in June, and actually basically the same in July. So because again, we saw this milk coming back in, a positive amount here in the Northeast. So that's not nothing. That 10% decline was some money. Okay, 10% of a few billion pounds of milk adds up after a while. But it was nothing like, California went from 58% of the milk in class 3 in June of 2019 to 0.7% in June of 2020. You know what? I think there'll be serious discussions in the California about qualifying and touching base. Upper Midwest, big amounts, right? They went from 90% class, but Upper Midwest is a class 3 market. I mean, it's a cheese. It's, I mean, you know, it's got Chicago and Minneapolis, but it's got a whole lot of milk there, and most of it goes into the cheese vat. You know, went from 90% in June of 2019 to 50% in June of 2020. So, you know, the effects were big in the Northeast. They were bigger virtually everywhere else, actually everywhere else on this graph. Okay, and then the other thing that's been going on that caused the milk price to be lower for some people, depending on where the milk is marketed, is that because we got in a situation where we had to find a new home for milk quickly because the food service markets dried up and we had to go to retail, we had distressed milk sales, which means that we had milk looking for a home that might be sold at discounts, sometimes discounts of 30 to 70%. Hopefully not much of that's happening, especially for you. But when it does happen, then those losses tend to get blended across everybody. And then the other thing that's happened is we had some dumped milk, especially during the pandemic, right? If you were watching the news, it's tragic to see good product, you know, being dumped down the drain. We saw the same thing, by the way, with produce, with, you know, lettuce fields being plowed under, and with livestock animals where there was no place to process them. And I would argue that, you know, it was pretty stressful there for 6 weeks, hopefully much less stressful situation for you now. And that was kind of the consequences of going through that big change. Typically, there's some milk dumped every month on the federal milk marketing orders. So there's milk that doesn't make it to the plant. Maybe the truck broke down, maybe the plant had to go down for maintenance or something like that. So, you know, maybe it was contaminated for whatever reason. And so, you know, we've got a small percentage of milk, you know, 0.2, 0.3% in an order in a given month that ends up being dumped. And you know, you can still report that and pool it on the order and then draw out the lowest value class used for that milk. What happened in April 2020 was, this is the Northeast and the Mideast for comparisons, was 131 million pounds of milk in the Northeast order, got dumped in April of 2020. And I should tell you that for the US as a whole, 350 million pounds of milk were dumped in April. While we were kind of making that shift over and trying to find a home for milk. So the Northeast order actually had more than 1/3 of the milk that was dumped in the United States. And part of that just reflects where the milk is going here, right? I mean, the good news about being in the Northeast is you live close enough to serve the markets of Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia. The bad news is a lot of people eat out in those markets. And when they went from eating out half of the time to not eating out at all, we had to find a home for things. And that resulted in milk being dumped, which was pooled and paid out at the lowest value price, which was class 4, which beats nothing, but certainly was not profitable milk, you know, in that situation. And it has gone back to normal milk dumping since then. Okay. So, but, you know, any losses from milk dumping or distressed milk sales are going to get blended across the wherever you're marketing your milk, and that might result in a lower milk price also, sadly. I hope you guys are all still awake out there. So let me just talk. What's that?
There was one question.
Yeah.
You still have it up?
So there was one question about the class 4.
Uh-huh.
And the question was, hold on one second.
Why has the price been so low, I believe, right?
Oh, okay. Any specific reason why class 4 is lagging so far behind? And this was from Brian. And I know we talked about some reasons, but I think he's looking more at specifics.
Okay. Well, so that's a good question. I think there's several factors contributing to class 4 lagging behind. The biggest one is that one way we got rid of, when people went from eating about half of their meals out to eating all of their meals at home, they changed what they ate. And historically, people have eaten more dairy products when they're eating out than they do at home. Not everybody, but the average consumer in the United States does. And so we have had a loss of demand. It's not been a huge loss depending on where you're at in aggregate, but there has been a loss of demand. And a lot of that meant that if you look at the daily production of butter, it really ramped up in May and June. And so we've had more butter production, everything else equal, than we had in the past. The other thing is, and part of that so a little bit less butter consumption because people have been eating a lot of butter eating out, and a little bit more butter production, fairly inelastic demand and supply. The other thing is that and this is not just true in this country, world prices of butter have been lower also. So part of it is, we've been more in line with international butter prices. We've been much higher than international cheese prices. And I think in the long haul, the outlook for butterfat in general for demand is really good. But right now, we just have, well, I'll tell you what, I'll show you stocks in a few minutes here. Well, maybe I go down there and do it now if I can find it. So here's the big reason for butter. This is stocks of butter annually for the last 4 years. 2020 is the red line. We have a lot of butter. That's not huge. It's not like catastrophic or anything, but you can see that we have built butter stocks to be, a couple percent above where we had been the last few years, where we've been more well balanced. Okay, so we just have some stocks of butter that are overhanging the market. And I think because of international prices, we're not looking at super, and also I think there's just this kind of concern about the income effect of this pandemic, not just in this country, but internationally. So if we want to look at exporting this, are we going to be able to do it? And that's not a huge amount of butter. This is nothing like the early 80s where we've got to worry about working that off. But we have built some butter stock because to balance these markets, the butter churn started going harder. Okay, so hopefully that answers that. But I'll come back to that a little bit more. So I think Dave wanted I wanted to say a couple things about the checkoff here. Okay, you guys all know when you sell milk, 15% of it goes to the checkoff, or not 15%. 15 cents. 15% would be a lot. I'm glad it's not 15%. 15 cents a hundredweight gets paid, okay, into the dairy checkoff. And by the way, 7.5 cents a hundredweight of milk equivalent gets paid by importers when they bring product in. So what we basically said was, look, if we're going to do advertising for, cheese and butter and fluid milk. And if you are importing cheese and butter into this country, then you're benefiting from the fact that we're doing advertising for your product as well, because we can't say we're just advertising U.S. butter, we're advertising butter. So they pay 7.5 cents a hundredweight equivalent, okay? And that 15 cents that you pay, 10% of it, up to 10 cents, can stay with the state or region. Doesn't have to. Most places, the state or region keeps the 10 cents to spend on their own programs, and then 5 cents of it goes to the national. Okay, in 2017, which is the last year for which there was a report. So if you figure 15 cents a hundredweight, if you have an average U.S. cow, which is 25,000 pounds, okay, then that's 250 hundredweight annually, okay? And so 250 hundredweight times 15 cents is $37.50. So, so if you have more productive cows, you're going to pay a little more. If you have less, you're going to pay a little less. But, $37.50 a cow. And we've got 9.3 million milk cows in this country. So it makes sense that we're talking about farmers paying in a little over $300 million. Okay, so 328.5 million collected in 2017. There's also the Milk PEP program, which collects 20 cents a hundredweight for processed milk from the processors, okay, which was $83 million in 2017. So between the two of those, that's what, $412 million in 2017, which was the last year for which the report is available. But it's going to be in the same neighborhood, a little bit higher maybe. And then these are the organizations. So we've got the national organization, we got the state or regional one. You can see the different organizations across the country that have the boards for how they use these funds, and I'll talk about how they use them. So, you know, we're in New York, and you can see, you know, you get the American Dairy Association and others that are determining how they're going to use it within the state, and then national programs. And checkoff funds can get used for one of three things. One is generic advertising. The Got Milk campaign is probably the most famous one for dairy ever. And furthermore, they're bringing it back. So that one was a hit. That one was originally actually came out of California. So the Real California Milk program here, they're the ones, some advertising agency in, I believe it was San Francisco, came up with the Got Milk. Actually, it's a pretty entertaining story with how they came up with that. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but basically the execs in that advertising firm were trying to think of something to do. So they went to the break room and got rid of all the milk and put in a video camera and watched everybody come in and look for milk to put in their coffee. And then after they couldn't find any milk to put in their coffee, they asked them about their reactions and stuff. And that's how, and then they were like, people were like, does anybody have milk? And that's how they came up with the Got Milk thing, which was very successful program by any measure. But there's other ones, right? There's cheese and butter programs, just, you know. So when I say generic, I mean it's not a name brand. It's not a pick a store brand or pick a private label brand. Okay, the advertising doesn't promote those. It promotes beverage milk in general. So if you want to do private label, that's your own deal. Then the second use is new product development or innovation. So they give out grants and they support activities that are looking at new ways to use milk. They're doing things like working with Little Caesars and Domino's. I think it was Little Caesars that first came up with the stuffed crust with the cheese in it?
Pizza Hut.
So was it Pizza Hut?
I don't know. I think so.
Yeah, well, you know, so part of that came from this checkoff funds, okay, which is them working with these the companies that are using the product to say, hey, what are ways that we can get more cheese, more butter, more, you know, what ways can we get this out there? And by the way, my kids think stuffed crust is great. So, you know, that was a good use. And so that's the second thing they can do. And the third thing is nutrition education, which is working with schools, and it's working with programs like the Fuel Up to Play 60, where they're teaching kids that, you know, you can that milk is a good thing to drink after exercise. Which my oldest son, who's a pretty serious athlete, thinks that chocolate milk is about the best thing that you can drink after exercise, and so do a lot of other people. And also, this nutrition education is also doing things like making certain that the word gets out that, in fact, fat is not bad for you, like we used to think in the 1980s. And that, in fact, it's a good part of a healthy diet to have animal fats, and specifically butter fat in there. So those are the kind of activities that they're doing with the funds. And then I just, you know, I won't claim to be any big expert on this. I have read these reports. They are mandated annually. They're done by an ag economist who's at Texas A&M. The impacts of the checkoffs used to be done historically, actually, at Cornell for many years. And now they're done at A&M, and I'll just refrain on commenting on the A&M versus Cornell thing. But I will say this. The benefit cost ratio is how many dollars of benefit do they estimate you get per dollar that you spend on generic advertising for that product. And you can see that, and this is for 2017, which is again is the most recent year available. And these are well-respected economists that are using well-respected models. Okay, and so their estimate is $3.27 benefit for every dollar you spend advertising the beverage milk, $3.94 for cheese, and $15.93 for butter. I got to tell you, if I was going to be skeptical of a number, it would be butter. However, I would also say that butter consumption has increased 20% in the last 6 years. Now, it wasn't huge to begin with, but a 20% increase over a 5 or 6 year period is a pretty serious increase. And that's not just, that's all these uses for butter. You know, when McDonald's decided that they were going to start using butter in everything instead of the margarine or whatever they had been using, I think that McDonald's decision alone, which happened in what, 2015 or 16, was 25 million pounds of butter a day or something like that. Some ridiculous number like that. And when McDonald's decides that they need to do it, then you know Burger King and Wendy's and others are going to follow suit, because that's the way it tends to work. So, and I think that part of what you're seeing with that butter number there is probably a little overestimation, because we're seeing such large increases in butter consumption, which isn't to say that the advertising had nothing to do with it, but I don't know that we're going to assign it all to advertising. But I don't really want to get into spitting match with these guys either without studying more. But anyway, the point is that all of the research would suggest that it is money well spent.
So Chris, there is a question on that.
Sure.
Jeff is asking, can producers obtain a report on how these funds are spent within their region? And the second part is, does anyone analyze the effectiveness of these advertisements? And I know we just talked a little bit about that, but
Yeah. Well, and so the only effectiveness that I know of is these benefit cost ratios that are done on these three products. And I don't know of anybody that's doing those kind of, and so this is also an average across the country, right? So in the Northeast, we're, spending money a little differently on some different products than they are in the Pacific region or the upper Midwest. And, I think you guys get to vote also on who's members of these boards that are deciding how this money is spent. And I think that's an important set of decisions. My experience when I've worked with these boards is that everybody there is working hard and is very well intentioned and is certainly doing the best that they can. As far as how the money is spent at the state or regional level, there is definitely a report that's audited by an accounting firm on how every bit of that is spent. And you know what? I'm sorry that I don't know that I can answer the question whether you're allowed to obtain that or not.
I mean, I would think that the American Dairy Association in the Northeast, that
I would think that they would make it available if you asked.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean,
right. So, I mean, I don't want to keep bringing up Michigan, but I was on the board of directors in Michigan for the United Dairy Industry of Michigan and American Dairy Association of Michigan. And I did see those reports, and there was nothing in there that anybody would have thought was top secret. So I would think if you were interested in how they were spent, that you could query that from the American Dairy Association of the Northeast or whatever the relevant region is. But I would, I'm.
Hi, can I chime in?
Sure, go ahead, please.
Hi, this is Robin from Cornell Cooperative Extension of Lewis County, and I know the dairy promotion order for New York. They just got done awarding grants for the coming year, so they use that checkoff money or the 15 cents a hundredweight or part of that for New York State.
Right, 10 cents. Yep.
And those are awarded. It's public meetings. I know Cornell gets a lot of money for research projects, and also they have separate monies that are for promotion. And those are available on Ag and Market's website on the dairy promotion order in terms of what was proposed, what was awarded, how much. But I think, Chris, I don't think they have a way of determining how effective they were necessarily. You're right.
No, yeah, that's true. That's a good point, and thank you for bringing that up, and thank you for giving us that information. The thing about research is, and there's a real art and science to evaluating the impacts of research, and I would say, well, I can't speak to any of those specific projects that were done here because I haven't seen them. In general, if you look historically at the economics of research and innovation, especially on agriculture, one of the reasons U.S. agriculture is so good, and one of the reasons that we have such a safe, affordable, reliable food supply is that we have historically put a lot of money into ag research, and it has really paid for itself. And actually, in the last 20 years, and this definitely is in the ag econ profession, it's not out in the public, it probably should be more. We have been under-investing in ag research in the last 20 years in this country compared to what we had done historically. And I think, and there's a lot of people that are concerned that it will catch up to us if we don't do more. So I can't speak to those products, to those specific grants, but you can go look at them. And, I think in general, that's been money well spent. And thanks for bringing that up.
Chris, I would make one comment, I guess.
Sure.
That I kind of learned years ago is I sometimes have producers say, I haven't seen too many advertisements for cheese or whatever it was. And I've learned that where do you spend the money? Who buys your products? Consumers. So the money is where the people are. It's not so much in upstate New York, rural upstate New York. It's in New York City, Boston, where the people are. So that's something to kind of keep in mind from a standpoint of the ads that people see and hear.
That's a really good point, Dave. And the other thing that is kind of obscured in here, but the nutrition education, new product development, innovation aspects of it also, in recent years, they've been focusing more on also what I would call, maybe they wouldn't call it this, but what I would call public relations type aspects, which is helping people understand what life on a farm is like, because everybody is so far removed from it now that they don't have the context for farming. And, so if you go on the websites, you can see that they've got little videos and presentations, and they're encouraging things like breakfast on the farm and other things like that. That's also been part of it. And I think that's really important for maintaining the public's view of farmers, because honestly, and I know this from a fact because I've done this in the past, if you survey the US public about what the most admired professions are, actually farming is one of the very top ones. And I think it should be, and I agree with that, but it's important that the US public continues to think that, because it is important that they understand that they have a safe, reliable, affordable food supply that comes from people that are doing a good job for them. So that's also kind of part of this directly and indirectly.
So one more question, Chris. Actually, if you click back to your benefit cost ratios, Monica was asking, is the benefit cost ratio for wholesale pricing?
Well, this is dollars of benefit that come back to the dairy organizations per dollar that they spend on advertising. So it's not in terms of dollars per hundredweight or dollars per retail pound or anything like that. It's dollars of benefit coming back to the producer organizations, which would include from the co-ops and farmers and processors, okay, from per dollar that is spent on advertising. Does that make sense?
Monica.
Okay, so that means you're getting $3.27 of benefit or return for every dollar you spend on advertising. And as Dave said, that's going to be where the people are, and some of it's going to be print, some of it's going to be internet, some of it's going to be. But I do think that it is interesting that they're bringing the Got Milk one back, because that was such a successful one, which, you know, was iconic there for many years.
And Monica said, yes, thank you.
So, okay. Just, you know what, let me just finish up here by making a few comments on where we're at market-wise. And then you guys can all go to bed. Because you got to get up and milk cows. So right now, this is class 3 futures as of yesterday, class 3 and class 4. Class 3 is in red. You can see that massive divergence still for October. Now the October futures will close here in about a little over 2 weeks at the beginning of November, right? Because that's when they cash settle. So, you know, a little better than $21 milk. So we had kind of come down to, was it 19 something for September? We'll back up a couple bucks right now for October, and we're halfway through the month. So, you know, if we stay consistent here, we're probably not going to see a big drop yet this month. I wouldn't expect it. And then right now the futures market is above 20 bucks still for November, and $18 for December, and then kind of settling down in that $17 range going into 2021, which is not as good as what we were looking at the beginning of 2020, but you know, lots of things can change. The futures market at the current time is also predicting that we will work off some of those butter stocks, and that we will see a more of a convergence. And by the way, over the long haul, we would expect a convergence between class 3 and class 4 futures. Also, by the way, we have a couple of big cheese plants. One really big cheese plant in Michigan that's supposed to come online here, actually next week. I don't know if they're still on schedule, but that was originally the schedule. And so that will tend to push that class 3 price down a bit. And right now, I'm not going to get into it, but we got a huge block barrel spread. And the new plant that's coming online is blocks, which will help alleviate some of that difference, although maybe you're not super happy about that because you'd like it to continue to be higher class 3 prices. So if we get those class 3 and 4 prices converged a little bit and nothing's jumping around, then we're going to get back to a more normal PPD. And we're also, I mean, we're just going to have less, and if it doesn't move any more than that, we're not going to have any reason to depool either. Because we'll, you know, get a more stable relationship. So, you know, that's what I would call kind of an average milk price here is what we're forecasting for 2021 at the current time. And honestly, that's the way these dairy futures tend to work. They tend to come on the board at kind of the long run average price, and then wait to see what happens as far as supply or demand shocks. Spot cheddar prices. Here's where we've been the last 2 months for spot cheddar prices. Right now we're at what? Well, that's today, $2.70 a pound for 40-pound blocks, and what is that? $2.20 a pound for barrels. So what are we? 50 cents difference. It was $1 difference back there. Towards the end of September, middle to the end of September, that $1 was the biggest difference I think ever recorded between barrels and blocks. That is partly reflecting the difference in the way we're eating too, right? What do we use barrels for? We export them, and we make a lot of them into processed products. Some of those markets have been hurt a little bit more than, you know, if we're not eating out at Mexican restaurants and somebody was taking 500-pound barrels and making massive amounts of queso out of them that were going to Mexican restaurants, then we're not doing that anymore, right? So we got things like that happening at the same time. We're all eating at home and buying hopefully lots of cheese to eat at home, and that tends to be more in you know, the blocks, right? So so partly that's what's going on there. In the long run, they'll get back together, because either somebody's gonna, you know, well, actually, I was talking to a processor a couple weeks ago that traditionally bought blocks of cheese and then shredded them and did other things to them to get them ready for retail. And this processor was telling me that they had moved to buying 500-pound barrels because they just couldn't afford to pay the block price, and the barrels were so much cheaper. And so they had to figure out with their own processing equipment how they were going to handle 500-pound barrels. And they jerry-rigged some system to make it work, and good for them. So that increases the demand for barrels, of course, decreases the demand for blocks, but the demand has been so strong. So, you know, look, if we're going to drop off this class 3 price on this red line here in the next 3 months, then this cheese price, the top cheese price has got to come down, because 260 cheddar cheese price is not going to get you down anywhere near $17. I mean, it's going to be more like $25, depending on what happens with the whey. You can see, so what's going on with cheese? Well, here's the ending stocks. The red line is 2020. We're well below where we were a couple years ago. We're a little bit above where we were last year. So, you know, you can see that we built a whole bunch of stocks there, right? Look at that jump in it from March to April. Right as we got into the pandemic, stocks shot up, and that's what killed cheese prices. That went down to, you know, below $1 a pound. And then we worked that stocks off real quick because everybody's eating cheese at home. So, you know, and then there's your butter prices. And this looks like they're real volatile, right? Like, holy cow, look at that. But then look at the vertical axis on this graph, okay? It's moving up or down no more than 20 cents a pound, which is still some volatility, but it's not, you know, that's actually pretty low butter prices. The last 3 or 4 years in the fall, we've usually seen butter prices well above $2 a pound. And, you know, butter prices climbed there in the 3rd week of September. But what tends to happen with butter prices is once all the big companies have got their holiday buying set, then, you know, they tend to back out of the market a little bit. And as we talked a little bit earlier, we've got plenty of butter. So if I was worried about buying butter for holiday processing or holiday consumptions, I would be, I guess, fairly confident at the current time that I could go find some if I needed to, given the stocks. And so that's overhanging that butter market. And then let me just finish up, and I do appreciate your attention here for all this time while I do all this talking. This is the dairy margin from the dairy margin coverage program. And so what this is, right, is the difference between the all milk price for the United States and the kind of representative average U.S. feed price, which is made up of the U.S. corn price, the U.S. alfalfa hay price, supreme hay price, and the soybean meal price, Central Illinois, which is what they use as a proxy for the protein feed price. And you can see the dashed line is based on current futures, and the solid line is where we've been with that margin. So we can go back here to 2020, January. You can see we start off with a margin that was $12. It was really high, and then it just crashed in the first 3 or 4 months of the year down to $5. And if you were signed up for the dairy margin coverage program on your first 5 million pounds at 950 a hundredweight, then you probably got a pretty decent check for April and May. And so the reason I bring this up is we are currently during sign up time now for the dairy margin coverage program. And right now, this futures is saying, hey, it looks like if we, you know, as of today, we've got 3-4 months there that are below $9, which means if I signed up at $9.50, which, by the way, if I was going to sign up, that's where I would sign up on my first 5 million pounds of milk at $9.50, then I might expect a payment. But you know what? Maybe not, because it depends. Last year at this time, if we were looking at 2020, the market was predicting no payments at all for 2020 for the dairy margin coverage program. And of course, because who forecasted the pandemic? But you know, that's what tends to happen. We don't know what's going to happen as far as weather events. Hopefully we pull out of this pandemic and the income effects are not bad as far as on demand. But I bring that up because there's 2 things if you're a dairy producer that you might want to think about right now. One is the CFAP payments for round 2, which is $1.20 a hundredweight on the last 9 months of your 2020 production, which they take the April through August production, and I think they forecast the last 3 or 4 months, something like that. Somebody from FSA is on, they can correct me. Sorry if I screwed up. But if you probably signed up earlier for the CFAP round 1 payments, right? Which was on the first quarter of the milk production, the first 3 months. What was it, like 470, 100 weight within? It's got some limits, but just because you were signed up for round 1 doesn't mean you're signed up for round 2. You have to go sign up again. Okay. So, and right now the sign up is going on right now. It started about 3 weeks ago, and it's on through December 11th of this year. And the dairy margin coverage program, if you want to sign up for 2021 coverage, is started yesterday and is ongoing also through December 11th. And the sign up for both of those is at your FSA office. So if you go into well, I'm not telling you what to do. You have to make your own decision, because dairy margin coverage program, you have to pay some premiums. Okay, you have to pay a few cents. And so you have to make a decision whether you think the expected value there works for you or not. I will say this, at the 950 level on the first 5 million pounds, most of the time, historically, that has paid, but that's no guarantee. And the CFAP one, there's no decision there unless you're just opposed to government payments, because that's just money. So if you're going to go see your FSA agent, take a look at those. If you do sign up for DMC and you want to change your coverage level later, I believe you're allowed to change it up to the last day, but you should check with your FSA agent on that. That's what you want to do on your Wednesday night, right? Thanks for your attention. I'd be happy to have any discussion that you guys want to have here.
So Chris, I do have one comment, and this is from Dr. Corinne Bump. She is the ED over in Madison County. She was asking, going back to the Got Milk campaign, there has been conversation previously that it may have been unsuccessful from the standpoint of increasing sales. So you had said that it was successful. Was it a successful campaign in the marketing advertising component, or was it on its own, or was it successful even though it did not increase sales? Was there a direct correlation, or?
Well, I think what the research would say about it, well, first of all, that's a good point. And it was definitely successful from a marketing campaign, because they won a lot of awards for it, and I'm certain that they were very happy about it. But I guess, let me be careful about how I say this. It wasn't that it increased sales, although it did. So the argument here is it's slowed the decline in fluid milk consumption. So it did increase sales over what it would have been without it. That's what the research would suggest. And I can show you the studies on that. So basically what it says is, yes, during the time that was going on, fluid milk consumption was declining, because, by the way, it's been declining for the last 40 years. But that it would have declined more without this. And also, it's a fair point. It is also true that advertising is not the primary driver of this, right? A bigger deal over this time was people's views on milk fat and whole milk consumption declining for a long period of time there before the last 5 years, when the only category of beverage milk consumption that has been increasing in the last 5 years is whole milk consumption. We had a period there in the early 80s where we really saw a big decline in whole milk consumption, but it was largely offset by increases in skim and 1% beverage consumption. But then, starting about 20 years ago, skim and 1% milk consumption started declining also. And so that's when and then in 2010, we saw a big downturn in milk consumption per capita. And so, it's a fair question, I think, to ask, was it a success? Because over that, time when we had that Got Milk campaign, we still had, beverage milk consumption on a per capita basis going down. Total beverage consumption was still going up because we had enough population growth there for a while to offset the beverage milk consumption declines. But the research would say that that the drop would have been bigger without it.
And Brian did point out that isn't there a pretty direct correlation between milk consumption and cereal consumption? And I know that we've all talked in the past that there is a huge correlation between that.
Absolutely. You know what? And it's a really good point. I think there's like, 4 or 5 big factors that have been driving declines in beverage consumption and decline in cereal consumption, at least in part driven by people deciding that they're going to go gluten-free on their diets, which, unless you have some gluten allergy, makes absolutely no sense to me, but whatever, I'm just an economist. That definitely the decline in cereal consumption, the change in school milk rules, the increase in water consumption. There's a whole, set of factors there that have all contributed. And the big one, as he correctly points out, was the, people shifting away from eating a bowl of cereal in the morning. Although, I think this pandemic has led to, at least in some cases, cold cereal consumption going up, right? So it's going to be real interesting to see what's happened with beverage milk in the last 4 or 5 months once we start to get a clearer picture of what's going on there. Because I'm hoping that being at home has, led to some consumption changes that maybe will lead to some longer term habit changes.
So my next question is, and I will say that we are not accountants, but Laurel asked, are CFAP payments taxable?
Oh.
Account I've seen that they will be taxable.
Well, it's going to go on your income
Yeah,
and
we'll go
expense
on your
statement.
income
So
tax.
if it puts you into a taxable position of profitability, I would think yes.
I want to say that the CFAP payments are ordinary income, which would make them taxable, and the PPP, which was that loan program, right?
Yeah.
That was not, right?
I think that that's correct, but they're still trying to figure that out.
Yeah, so you can apply for loan forgiveness on those PPP loans.
Right.
I can't even remember what those stand for right now. I'm blanking on them.
Paycheck protection.
There you go. Paycheck protection program.
Yeah.
My understanding, right, was that was not taxable, but I'm pretty certain that the CFAP is just like any other government payment. It's considered ordinary income.
Ordinary income, yeah.
So Chris, out of the 3 of us here, Nicole, myself, and you, I'm the least economist person here. I'm the dairy person, but let me state something here, and you let me know if this sounds right. Producers oftentimes talk about the cost of production and how that relates to the milk price, which we know really it's not related. I mean, you did a great job, although it's very complicated and it's tough to kind of remember all the details. But the components are valued based on their usage and their demand. That's how we end up with these component prices for butter, fat, protein, and other solids. And that sends signals all the way back through the marketplace, back to the farm level. And I guess in simplistic terms, thinking about economics 101, supply and demand, those prices that get brought back to the farm level either signal the industry to produce more milk or to produce less milk. And typically when less milk is produced, that means that there are people going out of business. And as long as there is enough milk produced to meet the market demand, and even then some, and exports are certainly part of that, we're not going to see prices move up if there's more than an adequate supply. And of course, thinking back in 2014, where we saw record high milk prices, the markets were really tight, and that sent signals all the way back and drove prices up. So in essence, I guess what I'm saying is that in reality, over the long haul, supply and demand is still ruling the system from a standpoint of how that's affecting prices at the farm level. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah. No, I think you did a really good job of summarizing it. Yeah. You say you're not an economist, huh? Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I mean, like at the current time, we have these government payments, which may be distorting some signals, right?
Right.
And then when we have also government, which I didn't talk about, the food box program, which is buying dairy products to put in food boxes for distribution. But that's, and that's enhancing demand, but that's also serving needy people. And so it's really important, right? That they, so that's kind of a win-win situation. It can enhance demand for the products that are going into those food boxes and can help the people that need the products for consumption. And honestly, from an aggregate sense this year, we're spending an absurd amount, not really for dairy, but in aggregate sense, an absurd amount in government payments for agriculture. But we also are, knock on wood, in a once in a lifetime pandemic. Geez, I hope it's once in a lifetime. Right? Once in every 100 years. So that's to be the last one I see.
Yeah.
All of us.
Yeah, right. God willing. So yeah, no, but you're right. Look, we have moved, in the early 1980s, the milk prices at the farm level were pretty detached from supply and demand, right? We weren't exporting. We had a price support program that was pretty high at the time. And there's pluses and minuses there. And then we ratcheted that support price down, and we moved to a point where, there are some anomalies, and there's certainly some locations where things get out of whack. And, but we have kind of especially our powders, our non-fat dry milk, our dry whey, our skim milk powders. Those prices are really are just wherever the international price is, because we're exporting most of that. More than 50% of our milk powders we're exporting. The butter prices are fairly correlated with the international prices. The cheese prices much less so, and the fluid and yogurt and ice cream prices are much more regional and specific, but largely driven by supply and demand at those different levels.
Great. Does anyone have any other questions for Chris before we let him continue on with his evening?
Go to sleep, right?
Yeah, bedtime. All right, I do want to say that some folks have said thank you, and Corinne did say thank you for such a fascinating presentation. As a non-dairy farmer, I simply have no idea how to make sense of all this, and it makes me appreciate all the details and moving parts, hidden mysterious components of this. God bless our dairy farmers. So I would like to echo that sentiment, and thank you, Chris, so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. And
yeah, it was my pleasure. If anybody, there's my email address. If anybody, it's the easiest way to get a hold of me. If you want to see something or have something that you want to discuss further, I'm happy to do it. Happy to be working at Cornell and working with the New York dairy industry.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Chris and
Yes.
Dave, and thank you everyone for sticking around for 2 hours. And I hope you learned a lot, because I know it's always nice to listen about milk pricing.
At least we know now that it's not a couple of guys sitting in some smoke-filled room that's deciding what the price is going to be.
No, that's sugar.
Getting to it, but that's what some people think. So.
Somewhere else, Canada.
No, that too.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, you guys have a good night. It was nice talking to you.
Take
Okay.
care. It's good to see you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.